First of all, for everybody tuning in, let me thank you guys for caring enough to want to get as much information about justice, especially equal justice, and a lot of the candidates who are running for judge. We want to thank Graham Bosworth, candidate for Criminal Court Section D, and Jerome from the Freedom Foundation. I'm Oliver L.T. Thomas, host of the Good Morning Show, and of course, advocate for the kind of justice and reform that Graham Bosworth has been fighting for years. Jerome, with the Freedom Foundation, why don't you let the folks who are listening right now, what is the Freedom Foundation and what does it stand for?
Well, the Freedom Foundation is an organization that finds entrepreneurial opportunities for the formerly incarcerated and support the transition of our disregarded youth from childhood to adulthood. Many ways that we do it, but our method is to get them tied back to their community.
And you know, for folk who know you, you've been fighting for justice for a long time. Not just about you and your freedom, but about other formerly incarcerated and those men and women who are going through the system right now. When you looked at Graham Bosworth's candidacy, and knowing you, I haven't known you to get involved in politics much at all. But what was it about Graham Bosworth that attracted you to his campaign and the fact that motivated you to want to see him be judge of criminal court?
Well, one of the main issues that drew me to Graham Bosworth as a candidate for Section D is the issue of the money bail system. I'm an advocate to get rid of the money bail system. I fell victim to the money bail system in my own experience, and as I learned more about Graham Bosworth and his platform, he's also against the money bail system.
Graham, for people who know you, they know that debtor's prison and debtor's criminal justice and using money to hold minor offenders and crippled families. You've been fighting against that system for years. Explain to folk what the money bail system is, why it's been so debilitating, and why you've made this one of your platform, actually one of the foundations of your platform.
I mean, money bail is a system it's created by a bunch of different statutes in the code that allows for judges to set money as a means in order to ensure appearance and or keep people in jail if they're deemed a danger to society. And in some situations, judges have discretion. In some situations, they don't have discretion. The problem with money bail is when you create it, when it exists, judges have incentive to use it because they want to be seen as, hey, I'm doing what I need to do in order to protect people, even though frankly most of the time it's not necessary. Statistics show people show up for court regardless of whether or not they have bail. There are other ways in order to ensure that they show up for court other than bail. There are pretrial services that exist. There are third-party community service providers like drug treatment programs. There are church organizations that are designed in order to help ensure that people don't get stuck in jail simply because they can't afford bail, and in order to help ensure that they show up for court and give them the support systems that they need in order to get to court. You don't need money bail. You don't need to create a system where someone who can afford to get out of jail has basically a different access to justice than someone who can't afford to get out of jail. And this, frankly, in my personal opinion, a real problem. In terms of why I got into it, when I was in the DA's office, you see inequities, but you're isolated from the inequities, and you know something isn't quite right. And then when I went into private practice and when I started working as a public defender and I really started working with people and seeing firsthand the effect of this system and the inequities that are hard baked into the system, it became a real problem. I had a client. He was charged with distribution of drugs. It was a pre-Katrina case where cops did a controlled buy, and they didn't arrest anybody. They did something called an FIC, a field identification card. And this guy who they stopped for dealing drugs just gave a name. And so they wrote that name down. This was pre-Katrina. Then 6 years later, my client is in Dallas, Texas, and he's arrested. He's dragged out of his bed at 2 a.m. in his pajamas and dragged back to New Orleans to deal with this charge. And I sit down, I meet with this guy, he's like, I never dealt drugs in New Orleans. There's no evidence that he dealt drugs in New Orleans. There's literally a field identity card, and that's it, a kind of a grainy picture of the person in question. And I went to the judge, and I was like, this guy got dragged out of his bed on this. He's not a threat. He's not a flight risk. He's going to address this. He's probably innocent. The judge refused to let him out of jail. He sat in jail for, I think, 4 months while I subpoenaed his employment records in Dallas to show where he was working at the time, and fought with the DA's office for access to more information, more discovery. And I was able to prove that the person in question who'd given his name was actually his cousin. It wasn't him, and my client had actually been working in Dallas, Texas at his job on the day. But it took 4 months to get it, and he sat in jail in the meantime. He lost his house, he lost his job, he lost everything. And to top it off, when I was finally able to prove his innocence and get the charges dismissed, he got kicked out of the jail at 1 a.m. and left on the street barefoot.
Well, Jerome Morgan, we know too often that's been justice, injustice
Yes.
for a lot of us. You know, I got right into, man, talking to you about Freedom Foundation, who you are, but folk need to know this is the Jerome Morgan. You've made headlines both ways in both parts of your life. For folk who may not know who Jerome Morgan is, the head and one of the founders of Freedom Foundation, please give them a little taste of your life and why this is important to you.
Well, I was wrongfully convicted at the age of 17, wrongfully convicted for a second-degree murder charge of a 16-year-old black male. And I was found guilty wrongfully and sentenced to life in prison, meaning I would stay there, to the expiration of my life. And so it took me 20 years with the help of the Innocence Project New Orleans to prove my innocence and be released. But even after that, I had to bond out and pay towards bond. Eventually, 2 years after my release, I was exonerated. And so after my exoneration, I started the foundation, Freedom Foundation, along with 2 other guys that were formerly incarcerated. We wrote a book. We went around colleges and churches and stuff, giving symposiums, talking about issues of criminal versus gentleman and what defines a black male image. So, I've been in this fight since my release, and I won't give way. And, I'm trying to find the candidates that's going to support, real justice and not those injustices that he described.
And in your quest to find candidates, and one of the things I do know about you, from working with you, but also watching your work and listening to you speak, is that you're not interested in what people say what they're gonna do. You real specific about wanting to know what people have done. And I've heard you say that what you like about Graham Bosworth and his candidacy, you don't have to wait for him to do something once he's elected. You like the work that he's done in his life for criminal justice reform already.
Yes, I work with a lot of youngsters, even in my own family, and I met Graham Bosworth during that process. He represented a family member of mine who was young and got in trouble in school, dealing drugs or whatever, and he was doing the work. I was able to contact him myself and inquire about different aspects of the case on behalf of my nephew. And so, through that instance, I learned a lot about what he does and not what he's gonna do.
Graham, it's got to be flattering to you, right? This is the Jerome Morgan. It's not, we're being modest, right? But probably in this country, someone, this case was headlined. People know him around this country for his fight. To have in his fight for justice, even beyond him freeing himself, he's never given up. You got to feel good to know that someone like Jerome Morgan, right, who's got a lot to do, is drawn to your campaign.
No, absolutely. And what's interesting is when I initially met Jerome, he never threw his name around.
He wouldn't tell you who he was.
Do you know who I did? It was never even that. It was just what's going on in the case, and and worked diligently on behalf of his family member in order to make sure that his family member had as much support as possible. And that was it. He was down to earth. He was low key. He was clearly just concerned about his family member. And then to afterwards reach out to him and talk with him and find out that he was interested. Flattering is probably an understatement. I'm really honored.
Jerome, he is extremely modest, humble, good brother, man. He also knows the law. So you got to feel good when you see a candidate, who actually knows the law in its application, in its interpretation, because that's where we're missing it in many cases from judges and from attorneys who don't know what the law is as well as folk like you who've studied it behind bars.
Yes, you know, the one thing, like, we had conversation, the one thing that impresses me about Graham Bosworth is that he's gonna do the right thing. You know, it's not enough for him to be fair in his position, becoming judge, but he wants to be a judge that does the right thing, that exceeds the measure of fairness, because that can go either way. You know, judges need to do the right thing. And I feel safe and confident that if elected, Graham Bosworth will do the right thing.
Graham Bosworth, what is doing the right thing? Because so much about justice, especially for black men and people of color, it's been very little about doing the right thing. How does the Graham Bosworth Division D in criminal court, how do you impact and how do you change that?
I mean, I think it comes from recognizing the inequities that are hard baked into the system. I mean, recognizing that money bail, regardless of what the intent was, has created inequities. It's recognizing that the multiple bill, regardless of what the intent was, has created inequities. It's recognizing, frankly, that the non-unanimous jury system, regardless of what its original intent was, though, I mean, at this point, I think we all know what the original intent was, created inequities. And to be willing to then say, you know, due process, the Constitution is the most important document in question. And to recognize that when the system in Louisiana is not abiding by its constitutional obligations, stepping in. Now, when somebody gets a life sentence for possession of drugs, stepping in. When you see someone in jail who's about to plead guilty to a crime for no other reason than they're trying to get out, step in. To be not just you know, they like to say the judges are umpires, you call balls and strikes. That's too passive. When the system has inequities that are hard baked into the system, stepping in and actually making sure that everyone has an equal voice and an equal opportunity to be heard in the case.
Jerome, first name Hallie, last name Lulia. It's about time I hear somebody who wants to be judge, who actually wants to use and exercise the power of judge, because too often we hear judges say, my hands are tied. Well, it's you know, it's mandatory minimums, and I can't do this. Graham Bosworth, you're saying you're going to use your power as a judge to be fair?
The power still exists, I'm not going to lie. Judicial discretion has been limited to a large degree over the course of the past 40 years.
But where you can use it.
But it still exists, and I think judges are too often scared to use the authority that still exists. You know, they're worried about getting overturned. You can't be scared about being overturned.
Graham, before we end this session, before Jerome, I'd love for Jerome to ask you a question before we close it out. You know, I was listening to, and I know Jerome was busy with their tour, their panel discussions, educating people through freedom. But, you know, you're an attorney, man. You know, once you went into private practice, how did you find time? Sentencing Commission, the piece you used to do on sentencing reform on the Good Morning Show, non-unanimous juries, going to schools, talking to kids, taking on cases where folk couldn't pay you. How'd you find time for it?
I didn't sleep a lot. No, I mean, it's been a busy profession, and I mean, there's no question. You know, long answer to a short question. When I was in college, I remember looking at friends and having friends who were really involved and were always doing good. And I remember thinking, boy, you know, at some point in my life, I'm going to do that. I lost a family member a number of years ago, and I realized that you can't wait for that time to happen. You actually just have to do it. And it was clear to me that I needed to step up and do something for my city and my community. And I started doing it.
Finally, a candidate who's not saying what he's going to do, but already doing it. Jerome Morgan, the Jerome Morgan, anything you want to ask candidate for criminal court section B, Graham Bosworth. Any questions or any comments before we close this out?
Of course, the one question I want to ask, you know, I know you're quite aware and been involved in the judicial system, that, you know, majority of people that end up in the courtroom are black and brown people that are impoverished. So will you and how will you consider the mitigating circumstances around any particular crime that a black and brown person may be confronted with you?
And that's why he's Jerome Morgan. Great question.
And I mean, the answer is obviously yes. You can't use a one-size-fits-all approach. You have to recognize where people are coming from and the issues that they faced and the hurdles that they've had when you're trying to ensure that people come out of the system better than they went in. And that really, in my mind, has to be the overarching factor. So if you have somebody there on a theft charge, but you know that they've been addicted to drugs, you need to make sure they get drug treatment. And you need to realize that jail hasn't really helped. We incarcerate more people per capita than any place on the planet, not the country, but the planet. If it worked, if that was a solution to crime, we'd be the safest place on the planet, and we're not. We have lost sight of the fact that we need to actually make sure people come back out better than they went in, and that means taking an individualized approach, looking at where they've come from, what's gotten them there, their needs, and then trying to give them access to the services to make their life better.
Well, you know, it's important to vote. We want to encourage everybody to vote.
Yes.
Go vote, exercise your right. A vote for president is important. Please vote in all the elections. But don't miss the chance to vote those down ballot races, like judicial elections that matter in our community. I'm Oliver Thomas. Some folk call me OT. This is Jerome Morgan. And Graham Bosworth, if you could tell the folk who are watching this segment, you know, your number, your name, and all of that good stuff about being a candidate. Who are you? What's your number and what section?
My name is Graham Bosworth. I grew up here in New Orleans. I'm from the Holly Grove Dixon neighborhood. I am running for Judge, Criminal District Court, Section D. I'm number 87 on the ballot, and I'd appreciate your vote.
You promise to do more of these even after you're elected?
I promise to always be involved in the community. Judges can't know where people are coming from and their individual needs if they don't understand the needs of the community.
And Jerome, last word for you. How can people support the Freedom Foundation in this movement you started for justice?
Well, they can access us online on our website, freedomfoundations.org, or they can call 504-609-9264.
Oliver Thomas, Jerome Morgan, Graham Bosworth, Criminal District Court, Section D.